guys, I'm Sai, and welcome to Ace Podcast Nation. We're back for part two on my show on addiction with writer Joshua Shea. We've been discussing Joshua's battle with alcoholism and also porn addiction. It's been a very interesting show so far, and we're just going to get back into it now. Um, yeah, so like one of my biggest worries as a father, I'm just going to slightly go off track slightly a minute, is the ease at which hardcore pornography can be obtained. Because when I was a kid in the 80s, 90s, so like I was a teenager in the 90s, um, basically my first introduction to pornography was we used to find carrier bags in the park or buy bins which had magazines in. And those magazines in the UK, there wasn't really like hardcore pornography in those magazines. It was naked women with the occasional kind of naked man next to the woman, but not anything sort of hardcore. That was the only introduction I had really had to porn until I was a bit older, and then people used to bring back like videos from holiday or things like, from foreign countries, like tapes. Whereas now, kids at the click of a button, if they know where to look, and you can take all the precautions you want as a father and as a parent. You can put blocks and safe search and all this thing. But, kids in primary school, so like, it's not called primary school in America. So like young kids, like 8, 9, 10 are learning, they learn, how to use a computer really quickly, how to do things, which I didn't know until I was in my teens. So by the time they're teenagers, they can navigate devices and computer and internet and everything so quickly and so efficiently that it doesn't take them long to work out how to get around blocks and safe searches and things. And I do feel it's a problem because, like, I'm not naive, like I've looked at porn and I know probably my oldest son probably has. He's 14. I'm not naive to think that he hasn't, because he's interested in girls and, he's at that age.
Totally normal.
But what I am concerned about, not just for my kids, but for all kids, is that I don't want kids to learn or think that, like, sex or making love to your partner or your wife is what you see on some of these websites. And if kids who are not emotionally developed enough to understand that it's a performance, or it's a, this, that, and the other, or there's different niches to it where things are more extreme, that does concern me. And I'm not really sure what the way around it is in terms of, like in Britain, for instance, I think they're trying to bring in a law where you have to use a credit card to prove your age, which obviously would block, no matter how good you are with the internet, would block a lot of sites for kids. But it's a problem, and I don't know. I'm not a prude in any way. I'm quite liberal. I'm quite, I'm open, and But as a father, obviously, my opinion has changed on access to porn and things like that to what it was when the internet first came out.
Right.
And when I was younger and I didn't have kids, I thought it was great. And now I've got to think about things like people contacting my kids who were, predators, or I've got to think about strangers contacting my kids, or what my kids are looking at on the internet. It's like a whole new world. I apologize because I've gone off on a bit of a tangent.
That's okay. I know exactly what you're getting at and what you're asking. And first thing I'll say is I think it's very good that you're not naive enough to think you can control your children's access to the internet. Because even if you're able to put the best blocks on at your house, your kid still goes outside, and your kid has friends, and your kid has the outside world. So any parents who are fooling themselves that their blocks are working, and even if they are working, there's a whole big bad world out there. And the thing is, with kids, as you mentioned, you and I think we're about the same age. We had to find the magazines, we had to find the videos. Now everybody's walking around with this in their hands, and while it's great to talk to people and great to get news, it's also the greatest porn machine that's ever been invented, because we can carry it around in our pockets, and that deals with kids too. And you mentioned that, how do you tell your kid that what they're seeing on the screen isn't real? You answered your own question. You tell your kid what they've seen on the screen is not real. I think that, times change, times evolve. Our parents, our grandparents, they had to worry about the atomic bomb. They had to hide under desks in air raid drills. That's nothing that you and I have to do. The world changes. The fears and the dangers of the world evolve, and we have to evolve as parents with them. Kids want to get direction. Kids want to learn. Kids want to be told the difference between right and wrong. Now, as parents, and even in our school systems, they're taught things like drugs are bad for you. Junk food is bad for you. They're taught that certain substances are good and bad. Nothing is said about pornography in schools. I think that, if we're going to have some impact on this, we've got to start doing it in the house. Now, there's a statistic here in America that's absolutely mind-blowing. It's from 2017, and they interviewed about 1,000 guys between the ages of 18 and 30. These are the men who have never known a world before the internet. And what they found was 32% of these men, basically 1 out of every 3 men under the age of 30 in America, either self-identifies as having a problem with pornography or as being a porn addict themselves. 1 out of 3, that's friggin' scary, because if nothing's done about these guys, they're going to become 40, they're going to become 50. If the statistics continue to grow as higher percentages of younger people use, you're talking about a world in 30, 40 years where 40 to 50% of the men in America of all ages are addicted to pornography. So how do we combat that? We start talking to our kids at a young age. We teach our children how to cross the street correctly. We don't scare them and say a giant truck can come by and smash you to bits and you'll be dead. That's scary. We don't talk about it like that. You can go to a 4 or 5-year-old and say, if you're ever using your computer or your tablet or you're with a friend and they show you something on their phone that you don't like, just come let me know. That may be pictures of naked people who are doing things with each other. And if that doesn't make you feel good, if you see that, just come let mommy or daddy know. And you can leave it at that. Just leave it at that. Yeah. The way you tell them, if you see a cigarette, don't touch it, walk away, go tell mommy and daddy. And then as you get older, 9 or 10 years old, you can have a conversation with them that's a little bit more explicit, that starts to talk about certain body parts. And you'll probably see pornography soon if you haven't already. The average child in America is exposed to hardcore pornography for the first time at 11 years old now. And I imagine it's probably the same over there. Probably similar. We have very similar cultures. And so having a conversation around the time that they're going to statistically see it for the first time is a good thing. And now you're talking to your 13, 14-year-old son, he's going through puberty. He's experiencing these changes with his body, completely normal things, completely normal to be curious, completely normal to want to see pornography at that age. But you just have to let him know this is a lot like drinking. This is a lot like drugs, where there are people who develop problems with this, who need to be careful of it because it can turn into a problem that's just as bad as any other addiction. And what you need to know is that what you're seeing on the screen is not real life. This is not the sex life for anybody in real life. This is not how things actually operate. You're not seeing anything to do with love on the screen. You're just seeing, the sex act. And I think also, maybe even a year or two beyond that, depending on, your child, what's age appropriate. I think that what we have to start doing is telling our teenage boys about this thing called PIED, which is porn-induced erectile dysfunction. What the experts are finding now, doctors are finding now, is that a lot of males in their late teens and early 20s have developed this condition where they can only reach climax sexually if they are watching pornography. They can have the sexiest girlfriend in the world who's wild in bed and will do anything that they want, and they still can't reach an orgasm with that person unless they have pornography on in the background.
That's frightening.
That's frightening because that's something that's going to stick with most of those guys for the rest of their life. And that's not something they knew about when they signed up for it, because we're not educating anybody. So letting your 15, 16-year-old son, who's probably at the age he's about to start actually having sex with girls, if you look at things statistically, or just before it. Yeah, realistically, or just before it, which is a perfect time to start talking to them. You can make it age appropriate, and it needs to be something like drugs, like drinking, like crossing the street, like the other ills in society. Yes, our parents didn't have to deal with it, but we do. And unfortunately, it's the world we find ourselves in now. And I called my first book The Addiction Nobody Will Talk About, because it really is an addiction nobody will talk about. Since pornography involves naked women and sex and masturbating, we all like to pretend we don't look at pornography. But the fact is, under 30 years old, 80% of men look at pornography, and 30% of women look at pornography at least once a month. You move it up to our age group, between 30 and 50 years old, 2 out of 3 men look at pornography at least once a month, and about 20%, 18 to 20% of women do. So it's not like people aren't looking at porn. They certainly are, and it's not like everybody becomes an addict, because they don't. But much like drugs, we tell our kids not to use drugs. Well, some of them go off and use, and nothing happens, and it's a phase, and they get done with it. Some of them never touch it, hopefully. And some of them develop problems. I think that if we deal with pornography, and speaking about it to our kids the way that we deal with drugs, we'll find a steep drop in people who are developing problems with it.
Yeah, some of those statistics are frightening, but like you say, it's realistic. Especially like people like to think that their kids are not looking at pornography, or they're not having sex with their girlfriends age 15. But you gotta be realistic.
That's
some of
when
them
I
are.
started.
Yeah, same here. And it's like, some people. If you pretend to yourself as a parent that they're not doing those things, it doesn't mean they're not doing them. It just means they're doing them without any advice from you, their parent, to do it safely, to do it appropriately, to whatever it may be. But
our children are sexual beings, like it or not. You want to have grandkids someday, your kid's going to have sex. And that may not be when they're 25 and married. In fact, it won't be when they're 25 and married. So you might as well equip them as best as possible to make the best decisions as possible, because that's what you want from your kid. You want them to make the best decisions as possible when you're not around. And the way you do that is through communicating with them from the very earliest days.
Absolutely. So just going back to your story, obviously you were drinking heavily. You'd been looking at porn from a young age. When did the viewing of porn become an issue in your life?
Well, it was, like I said, it was much like the drinking, where it was a coping mechanism. It was an escape. The one thing that porn was different for me than alcohol was it was a way to exhibit control. And that's the thing that I always, despite all appearances, I never felt like I had control of my life. The only time I had, or over who I really was, the only time I had control was when I was playing the part of city councilor, or playing the part of magazine editor, or playing the part of local celebrity at different charity events. That's when I felt like I was in control, but I wasn't being me. I was playing these characters. The only time I felt like I had control of myself was, very late at night when I would get on the computer and look at pornography, because I could decide what I wanted to look at. If I wanted 2 blonde girls, I got that. If I want a couple Asian girls, I got that. If I want to watch an orgy, I get that. It's just a click of a button. I have what I want. And the person on the screen is not going to bother you with talking. The person on the screen can't say no to you. Pornography was a big control piece for me. And what happened with me was that I started my magazine in 2009. That introduced a whole lot of new stressors to my life. I started using a little bit more porn, started drinking a little bit more as the stress built. About 4 years into running my magazine, so we're hitting about 2013 here, my magazine stopped being the new cool hip thing because it had been around 4 years. And there were people who were advertisers who recognized that maybe their advertising worked better on radio, or maybe it worked better in a newspaper versus a high-end magazine. So what happened was my revenues started to plateau, yet my expenses kept going up. And I'll be completely honest in that I'm not a good businessman. When I have a lot of money coming in, I can hide the fact I'm not a good businessman because I have too much money. When I have to be very toe the line, I'm not good at it. And that started causing me massive, massive anxiety, massive, massive stress. And what I did was I made this horrible decision to pull myself off of my bipolar medication. I was diagnosed bipolar when I was 22, 23 years old. And I remember in my late teens, early 20s, feeling like I had this reserve of energy that I never had after I got on the pills. I had this untapped well of creativity that kind of died after I went on the pills, or at least I romanticized that it did. And I made the horrible mistake of telling myself, if I'm going to save this company, I need to pull myself off of my medication that I've been on for 15 years. I need 2 or 3 more hours every day. I need this little well of creativity I haven't used in a long time to save things. And unfortunately, instead of hitting a manic phase, instead of, tapping into all of this, I went the depressed route of bipolar, and my drinking and my porn use overnight probably tripled. Drinking wise, instead of just drinking at night when I got home or just, at social events, I was drinking, at noontime. I would go to the local pub on my lunch and start drinking. Right after work, I would have every meeting I possibly could at, and I don't know if you have it called happy hour over there, but, right after work, drinks are a little bit cheaper. So I would always have my meetings at the pub. And then once I got home, I was drinking even more at night. And the pornography went from just being on video clips on a screen. Again, the addiction, you have to keep moving things forward. You have to escalate things. I made the jump over to chat rooms. And I'm not talking about webcam chat rooms where it's a model. I was using these chat rooms that are cam to cam, where you can click on the button. If you don't like it's 2 people. If you don't like what you see, you click the button and you get a new person. You don't like what you see, you click the button, you get a new person. Same thing on their end. And what I actually started doing, and this was kind of like catfishing, was I figured out, instead of them seeing me, who was, a guy in his, late 30s who really looked haggard because of everything going on in my life, I figured out how to run a video in my screen. Essentially, the way you and I are talking here, I could put up a video instead of my picture. And I found a video of a really good-looking guy in his early 20s who was just typing away. They actually made these catfishing videos, and I found one and I figured out how to operate it. So suddenly, instead of no women stopping and talking to this, which looked, I probably looked 10 years older and 50 pounds heavier at the time, I ran this video and suddenly women were stopping because, much like men, women are turned on by something attractively visual. So I could get them to stop. And I became interested very quickly in seeing if I could get them to do things they didn't want to do. I didn't just say, hey, show me your boobs, and they'd whip up their top. That wasn't what I was after, because I wanted a challenge. I wanted to try to accomplish something. I wanted control. So I liked finding a woman who seemed like she would never do that. I liked, over an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, getting to know her, breaking her down, because what I do is on half my screen where she's watching this guy on a loop, just typing away, I was on the other part of my screen, whether it was Facebook or Google or whatever it was. She would give me a little bit of information. Oh, I graduated from this university 2 years ago, and my name is Jennifer, and I'm originally from this place in New York. And I just, as a journalist, I'm very good at asking little questions. I'm very good at gleaning information. I would be on the other side of my screen just researching this person. I could do something like I would find her Facebook page and, oh, look, there's a million pictures of her riding horses in competitions. So all of a sudden I'd make up a story about my sister who was a competitive horse jumper, and suddenly she'd feel close to me. And I would slowly introduce the idea of sex or the idea of exhibitionism to the conversation. If she didn't, if she was turned off right away, I'd pull back a bit. And it was just a little, it was catfishing. It was just back and forth, pull and tug. And not every night was I successful. Those were the nights where I felt like I was a loser. Those were the nights where I couldn't accomplish anything because my life was imploding on the outside. My businesses were failing. My relationships with my business partners were failing. My addictions were going out of control. Because of my relationship with my family was starting to crumble. I was only sleeping, once again, 2-3 hours a night. My personal hygiene was absolutely disgusting. And the memories of things that happened to me when I was young were starting to pop up because I was scared to death. I had more anxiety than I'd ever had since my childhood. So I was basically triggered into remembering this stuff. So I'm trying to cope with these memories that are new because I'd really repressed most of them. And I have a few different counselors and therapists have told me it was just a perfect storm of events happening. And the only way I found relief was going onto the computer and trying to control somebody on the other end. And if I controlled them correctly, I felt like $1,000,000. I took a woman who didn't want to do anything sexual, and in 2 or 3 hours, I was able to turn it around and control them and get them to do something they said they would never otherwise do. And so it wasn't about sex. I knew how the internet worked. If I just wanted naked girls, if I just wanted sex, I could find that 1,000,000 times over. I needed to exhibit this kind of control because that's what the pornography was always about for me, was control. And at the end of the night, after I'd done this with a woman, towards the very end of our time together, I would go ahead and I'd take 2 or 3 screen captures as trophies. I never used these for sexual satisfaction, never used them in any way like that. They were my trophies. And I was a guy who collected trophies. When I was winning trophies for my magazine or being awarded stuff for city council or my film festival, I had a wall full of plaques and trophies. That made me feel like I was somebody. It was proof that I was somebody because I doubted it. And so I would take these screen captures of these women. Now, I started doing this late summer of 2013 to help deal with my anxiety and my stress. I always did it in the middle of the night. If I found somebody who looked like they were a child, I skipped right past them because I'm not into that. And I preyed upon women that way. And then in March 20th, 2014, the Maine State Police showed up at my house and told me that they had reason to believe that I had child pornography on my computer. And that absolutely floored me because I did not see that coming. And we had a conversation. They provided me overtime with some evidence, and it turned out that one of these women was a teenage girl. I was so ill, I was so sick, I didn't care that there are 15-year-old girls who look like they're 25, and there are 25-year-old girls who look like they're 15. Thankfully, when the police went through all my little trophies and were able to figure out who a lot of those women actually were in real life, I think based on tags and IP addresses and stuff, that was the only one that was underage. But I was so sick, it just didn't faze me. As long as she had boobs and looked like she was old enough, that was good enough for me. And that is just not something that, even in my ongoing addiction for 20 years, that's not something I was capable of. But my addiction reached that third tier, which is the critical point. And I became so sick that I became capable of doing this kind of stuff. And, before we go on, I just want to make it known to you and to the people who are viewing, I don't blame anybody but myself. The addiction took over me, and I did things very out of character because of the addiction. But the addiction and it exploding was my fault. I knew that I had bipolar disorder. I made the decision to stop taking my medication. So I don't blame any of the women. I don't blame the alcohol. I don't blame anything else. This was me. I own this. I did this stupid, horrible, disgusting, heinous thing. And I served the price. I ended up doing six months in jail for it, which was absolutely deserved because I did this horrible thing. I never tried to claim innocence. Once it was proven to me that she was a teenager, I owned it, and I try to own it. Every day. I try not to minimize it. I try not to rationalize it. This is my fault that this happened. I created this victim in a horrible way, and it happened because I was never able to recognize I had drinking or pornography problems until it was too late.
Yeah, I'm sure you understand people's reaction when they hear it. Some people's reaction when they've heard you saying it there. It's difficult, isn't it? Because, to me, listening to what you've said, now obviously I've only got everything which you say as what happened, of course, but I can say straight away that coming off bipolar medication is a very bad idea. Yeah. Because coming off any antidepressants, antipsychotics, anything like that, coming off them, just coming off is so bad. And you do things which are completely out of character, and you do things which can be dangerous, and they can be dangerous to yourself, dangerous to others, because your brain is no longer being controlled by the medication, that's what it's for.
However, and it's a common thing among people with bipolar that they want to pull themselves off their meds.
Oh, I can fully understand it, because the medication which I used to take for anxiety, I hated it because it made me feel not like me.
Right.
And that's that was a big problem for me, because I didn't want to take it, but I needed it, and it's you've got to try and balance that out. So here you are, you're a respectable, hardworking man with a reputation, like we all said, and then all of a sudden, you're being questioned about something which I'm sure, if you read in the paper about a councilman who had been arrested for, child pornography charges, you would have read that as a father, and you'd have been like, oh, you'd have made a snap judgment if you were just reading a newspaper and
Absolutely.
reading it yourself. So did the police come to your house and then arrest you, or it was like an ongoing thing where they were interviewing you and then
they showed up at my house with a search warrant, and one of the two cars showed. I was sitting at my kitchen table doing work for my magazine the morning it happened, and two cars pulled up and a van pulled up. And you don't have to watch a lot of cop shows from the 70s to know what an unmarked car looks like. And it was clear to me this was the police. I had no idea why they were there, hand to God. I figured something bad had just happened to somebody. And when they showed up, I saw that he had the search warrant in his hand, and I could pick out enough words that I could tell what it was for, and was like, wow. So he came in along with two others. One of them took my computer and went to the van, and I won't get into the story about how the girl connected to the police and all that, but they knew what they were looking for, and they found what they were looking for. And we had a conversation about my porn use, about how I did this stuff online. And he told me up front, we know you're not a pedophile. We know that you're not, trolling rooms looking for 8-year-old kids. We know that's not you, but what you still did, or what we're going to be charging you with, is illegal. And I was like, I understand this. So we had a conversation for about an hour and a half. It was very cordial. I I got them coffee and we sat down very comfortably in my living room. When they arrested me, he apologized for having to put handcuffs on me, but it was because he knew I wasn't going to do anything stupid. But it was the way it was. But you're absolutely right about it becoming a big media thing. They took me off to jail. On my way to jail, he allowed me to use my cell phone to call my wife, and I told her, listen, I got caught talking to a 15-year-old girl online, and I need to have you come to jail and bail me out. They say it's going to be $500. And she was just like, okay, well, I'll talk to you when we get there. When I get there. And they brought me into the jail, and I was only there about an hour. They processed me, and then I sat in a holding cell for all of probably 10 minutes. And as I sat in the holding cell, I thought to myself, my film festival was only about 2 to 3 weeks away from happening. I thought to myself, can that film festival still happen? How big is this going to be in the newspaper? Can I lay low for a couple of weeks and go back to the magazine and keep working on it? Well, my wife paid the bail. I was out of there within an hour. We drove. My office was near the jail. So we drove to my office, and I got there because I wanted to grab some things to take home with me because I wasn't planning on being there for the next few days. And only the designer of the magazine was there. And I walked in, and he was like, "What did you do?" I was like, what do you mean? He said, we've already had one news reporter here, and it's all over Facebook, and it's all over the news wire that you were arrested. So they had a press release ready in advance for my arrest. And the moment that I was arrested, it got released to the media. So I told the designer, don't talk to anybody. I grabbed my stuff and I went down to the car where my wife was, and I said, this is going to be really big. She's like, no, it's not. I was like, no. I said, I don't think you understand how well known I am in this community, because she's too close to it.
Yeah.
She knows me for all the bad things and all my bad habits, and and I was nobody when she met me, and she didn't join me at a lot of these community events that I was at. So she didn't really understand the scope of it. It really came home to her when we drove back to my house and there was a TV news van there. So we drove and we went and picked up the kids at school. We then went over to my parents' house and started talking to them. That evening, 6 o'clock news, 2 news vans show up at my house, and they do live remotes from my front yard. I'm hiding out in my bedroom with my family. We're watching it on TV. I mean, that's really surreal because we're sitting in my bedroom watching live TV, seeing my front yard and seeing one of my dogs barking in the window.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh my God, that's our house. Oh my God, they're talking about me. And it was the time from my arrest to my sentencing was 2 years. And that's
a long time.
It is. In those 2 years, I went to 2 different rehabs, one for alcohol, one for pornography. I had hundreds of hours of one-on-one therapy back here in Maine and some group therapy. I went to 12-step groups at that time. I did, me being a reporter, me being an investigator, I read as much as I could about addiction and as much as I could about pornography addiction, especially, there was painfully little at the time, because I wanted to know all about this. And ironically, the version of me that went to jail at the beginning of 2016 was the mentally and physically and emotionally most healthy I'd ever been, because I was able to take 2 years and totally focus on my addictions, totally focus on getting healthy. And I spent 10 weeks. I thought I'd be there 4 weeks. I spent 10 weeks at alcohol rehabilitation in California. I spent 7 weeks at a pornography and sex addiction rehabilitation center in Texas. Like I said, hundreds of hours of learning how I became the person I did. Because addiction isn't the core problem. And that's a lot of the problem that a lot of young addicts have on these no-fap groups and these incel groups. They don't recognize that addiction is a symptom of a deeper problem. A lot of those problems going back to the trauma of when I was a kid that we talked about earlier. And I needed to unravel that. I needed to explore that. I needed to explore really growing up piece by piece and understand how everything in your life is connected. I treated my life as separate little boxes, and really everything is all interconnected. And I had to learn that. And I had to learn how my addictions fit into that and how they were coping mechanisms. And I had to develop tools to become a healthy person. By the time I got to jail, I was the healthiest I'd ever been. And that was where I wrote my first book, which was called The Addiction Nobody Will Talk About, because all of these guys I was in jail with, while they were there for drugs or domestic violence or probation violations, almost all of them had sex or porn issues in the background that they were more embarrassed about than their drugs. And it was eye-opening to see just how many people had these issues. So I made my decision. I was going to try to be a voice for support. When I got out of jail, I was going to finish my book. I was going to start a website. That's recoveringpornaddict.com. I was going to start to go on shows like yours and start talking about my story and all the research that I have, because we need to have a worldwide discussion about this. And, and that's how I got to where I am today here with you.
Okay, so Joshua, thank you for coming back on the show.
Thank you for continuing with me.
It's been a mammoth show.
See, so, I don't even have to go to therapy this week. I'm just doing this with you.
Yeah, that's it. So, okay, so I was gonna grill you a bit, as it were, just about. That sounds worse than what it is, but I was just gonna ask you some questions about, just kind of what happened, and because obviously, like we were discussing, your life got turned upside down, and by all accounts, it seems that it's not, you weren't. Or I'll tell you what, I'll ask you: had you ever viewed any kind of illegal pornography or anything like that?
None that I knew of. Now I was I see the young cheerleader, young woman thing as another genre of porn. Is it a genre that I have liked in the past? Yes, it was one that I routinely went to. Mm-hmm. Can I guarantee that every woman on every website that was always over 18? No, but I never willingly ever looked at somebody underage. And like I said, even when I was using those chat rooms, if I clicked the button and somebody looked like they were 13 or 14 years old, or looked like they were, a kid, I would click past them. Yeah. It was really bad judgment on my part when I didn't click past the one that I got in trouble with, because despite the fact that, she could have passed for 18 or 19, there are plenty of girls out there who can.
Yeah, of course. And so obviously, like you had mentioned previously, and you just mentioned again there, if you came across people in the cams that looked even, sort of borderline underage, you would move straight away. Would you engage them at all in like conversation first, or would you just move them along straight away?
No, because here's the irony: I don't like kids. I like my own. But I've generally have always been uncomfortable around them. I don't know how to talk to them. It's like I mentioned earlier. Even when I was a kid, I didn't like kids.
Of course. Yeah.
So they're just a. It's an awkward thing. And so, no, I wasn't there to talk to kids. I was there to try to engage women and play my little power games.
Yeah. So it's obviously, as I mentioned to you earlier, people will have seen, they read or they hear underage girl, sex offender, child pornography charges. And, like we all do, if I read a headline or a story about someone who's been involved in child pornography or doing something with kids, you're disgusted and you bring back hanging, or all the usual sort of tropes and sentences which people say. But obviously, in your case, it is slightly different because you weren't aware of it, you weren't looking for it. It was something which happened almost against your knowledge, because if you'd known that that person was not 18, you would have flicked off it, but you didn't.
But I should have checked. I mean, there was a great amount of negligence on my part that I have to
Yeah.
own up to. Like I said, I was in such a state mentally, and keep in mind, I was also drinking when I was doing this. But I
Yes.
was
Yeah.
in such a state mentally that I blurred the line between older girls and younger women.
Hmm.
And that's not a line you can blur. In the
No,
US,
absolutely not. Yeah.
it's a strict 18-year-old line. So whether they are 17 or 16 or 15, you don't go below that 18-year-old line. And I did. And so, as much as it kills me to say the words child pornography out loud, especially in terms of, me being part of it, I absolutely was part of it. And, I have to own that because, I allowed myself to get so ill that I didn't have my faculties and I wasn't thinking about cause and effect, and I didn't use any judgment at that point. I allowed myself to get to the point where I didn't have good judgment. And so I ended up with this girl. And should I have known? I saw a photo of her after the fact, several months later, and I looked at her and I said, I could make an argument for her being underage. I could also make an argument that she's 19, but
Mm.
she's underage, and I can't try to defend it. She was a child. I can't defend that at all. And unfortunately, it happened, and all I can do is figure out how I got that ill, figure
Mm.
out how I got to this place in my life, and then try to make it better and try to have some semblance of a life after it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have to admit and be completely honest, when I sort of started researching you and looking into, your books and kind of your website and the story, and when I saw that and I saw arrested sex offender arrested for child pornography, I thought about it. I was like, do I want to have someone on the show who's been found guilty of that? Because before I looked into it, in a bit more detail, I was kind of leaning towards no, I don't, because I don't, it's something which I feel quite strongly about. I'm, I've got kids myself, and in this day and age, you see it so much, people hurting children. It's almost like a daily thing in the UK, at least in the newspapers and on Facebook. There's so and so's been arrested. There's another paedophile ring has been, exposed and things like that. So I have to admit that I did have like a while there where I was not sure whether I still wanted to have you on, and that's just me being, completely honest with you. Um, so obviously I looked into it and I decided that yes, I would, because I felt that even just from the bit which I had read, on your website and had like read on the internet, I could kind of see that it had led it would the whole thing was, I wouldn't say it happened because of your addictions, but everything leading up to that was because of your addictions and because you were in that situation because of your addictions. So I felt that I would have you on and I would, hear your story and talk to you about it, because if that stops one other person making this, falling into the same mistakes and the same things that happened to you, then great. Because you're very lucky, I have to say. We're going to talk a bit about, the support you had afterwards from your wife and stuff. But I would say, if I was guessing or estimating, I would say 90% of women or wives would have probably said nope. And they wouldn't have stayed, they wouldn't have stuck with you. They wouldn't have supported you because they would have seen, the child uh, aspect to it, which, so many people will. And I'm sure some people will not, they'll say something to me for having you on the show just because of the nature of the crime.
Well, what they'll say to you is, why would you have that pedophile on the show
Mm,
when, in fact, I'm not a pedophile?
yes.
And that's one of those things that it's hard to explain to people. And I'm a very imperfect messenger of what I'm trying to say, because it does come from my point of view. It does. I am not a completely unbiased person
Yeah.
because of my situation, but I recognized that after I was arrested and after I accepted the fact that I had culpability here and wanted to know how I got here, and recognized that I had a real problem, I tried to find materials out there that I could read and see. And because I didn't define myself as a sex offender, I had this issue with pornography, but I had an issue with drinking, and I had, my family, and I had all these different things in my life. This was just a small part, but this was the small part that got me. Statistically, I probably should have driven into a house because I drove drunk far too many times in those last few months before the police showed up at my door. I only give even odds I'd be here talking to you today. I think I might have done something very stupid to myself not too much further down the road. I'm lucky the police showed up when they did, because I was on a bad road somewhere. And it happened to be pornography that got me here. And am I when they found my computer, they're like, "You've never sent a single picture to anybody." No, I never have. I'm not involved in any rings or trading or anything like that. And the district attorney, who I knew kind of through my magazine and through part of the city council work, he came to me and he said, "Josh, I have to tell you, only about 1 in 100 guys gets caught doing what you did. It's just unfortunate for you that you're the one." And that's that being the one probably saved my life. But yeah, it is tough, because I think most people who just read what happened in the newspaper, where it wasn't always reported correctly, or saw what was on TV, and they might brush over things quickly. I think that people got a view of the specifics of my case that was not always correct, or that they just didn't get into the details of it. A headline that says, city councilor found with child pornography. Well, there are people who jump to the worst conclusion of, I'm hanging outside a playground looking for little kids to snatch into my car, when that's a heinous, horrible thing that, I would never, ever be capable of, because that's not an addict who does that. That's a criminal who has a very different pathology and an attraction towards children, and a bent towards violence. But because you just use the term sex offender, I'm kind of thrown into that group. I'm on a registry here in the state of Maine, and the person next to me committed multiple child rapes. But we're on the same list. There's no differentiation whatsoever, because we're both sex offenders. Hopefully that will change as the years move forward and as we learn more about this, because I think there's a big difference between someone like myself, who was a hands-off offender, and somebody who violently put their hands on a small child. But again, I have a hard time being the one presenting that argument because of what happened to me, and a lot of people don't want to hear what I say or take what I say seriously.
Yeah, and I guess people think you're trying to almost justify it then, or they're trying to make excuses for it.
Right.
Whereas, what in actual fact, I guess what you're saying is exactly what you just said, is there's a big difference between the two crimes.
Right. And like I said, I own my crime. I absolutely own my crime. I try not to minimize it. I try not to rationalize or justify. I let people know that I don't do any of those things. But there is a difference between me and some, violent sex offenders. I really think on a spectrum, I'm on one end, they're on another. Doesn't make what I did okay, doesn't make what I did legal, but there is a difference. And I wish more people would kind of see that there are all kinds of levels of gray, and it's not just black and white.
Yeah. So what was so you phoned your wife, as you said earlier on. You phoned your wife to say you were being taken to the police station and being arrested, and what for? And she said, "We'll talk about it after." So she paid the bail. You went home then?
Yeah, I jumped in the car with her. First thing I said to her was, I will ask no questions. If you want to divorce me, I understand. I'm not going to fight you for the house, the cars, the kids, anything. I understand if you want to divorce me. And like I told you earlier, she said, well, did it involve little kids? And I said, no, not at all. It was a teenage girl. And she said, okay, well, we know that you've been sick for quite a while. And I didn't ask her, what do you mean? But she said, we know you've been sick for quite a while. Let's figure out how to get through this today. And like I mentioned, we went to my house. There was already TV cameras there. So we went, picked up the kids at school before school ended, went over to my parents' house and talked to them. My father had a lawyer or had a friend who was a lawyer. So we made an arrangement to talk to him the next day. And then, basically just tried to lay low that day while the media was trying to get a hold of me. The next day, I went and met my lawyer for the first time. And he immediately said, are we playing a litigation game or are we playing a sentencing game? And I said, we're playing a sentencing game. They have the proof that they need. I can't deny it. And then he said, okay, well, my next standard question is, do you have any chemical dependency issues, any drugs, any alcohol? And I said no. And my wife and my father both said he drinks too much. And I was like, oh, you think so? And they're like, yes, you absolutely drink too much. You have for a long time. And I was like, okay. And so he said, we're going to get you into a treatment center. And I was like, okay, yeah, whatever. If that's going to help the case, whatever. And he said, no, wait. We're not doing this just to help the case. The reality is, at some point, whether you get 3 months in jail or 3 years in jail or 33 years in jail, whatever happens, all of this legal stuff will be over one day. But you'll still have to live with yourself. Don't you want to be a much healthier version? Don't you want nothing like this to ever happen again? You've got time right now. Do something for yourself. Get better. And that's when it dawned on me that, okay, maybe he's right here. It still took me a few days when I got to rehab, about 2 weeks later, to really wrap my arms around the fact I was an alcoholic. But, on day 4 or 5, it was all of a sudden like, oh, I'm exactly who they're talking about here. And then several weeks of work there, I started to meet with a certified sex addiction therapist, what they call a CSAT over here. And that person really helped me to understand that I had a pornography issue. And it dated all the way back to being with that babysitter, because that's where I started to create some of my survival skills. And it was through talking to that gentleman that I decided I'd come home, get some therapy, and eventually go off to another rehab. So I was very lucky in the sense that in the 2 years between my arrest and my sentencing, there were a couple court dates in between, just little hearings. But in those 2 years, I essentially was able to work on myself full time. It was almost my job. I know almost nobody else gets this luxury. 10 weeks at a rehab in California, 7 weeks at a rehab in Texas, being able to spend time getting myself physically fit, eating well, learning all about addiction through reading, through talking to other addicts, going to 12-step groups and learning that system. I was very lucky. I got to immerse myself in this. So as I said, when I was sentenced and when I actually started serving my sentence a week later, I was ironically the healthiest version of myself I'd ever been.
Yeah, and you're right. Like, not everyone would have had that opportunity to address their issues and get healthy. And regardless of the situation which got you there, rehab is difficult, and it's not, if you don't want to get better, you won't get better.
No,
if you're not fully committed, it will not work.
I saw so many people who were either sent there by their parents or their families saying, we're never going to talk to you again, or we're going to cut you off. And I saw so many people who were sent there by the courts. None of those people either lasted their entire time, or I would hear about them getting out and relapsing almost immediately. Because unless you're there because you want to be, there is not going to be a recovery. You have to want it.
Yeah. So tell me about people's reaction to, obviously the news broke of your arrest. You spoke to your immediate family to explain. What about say you like your you know your close friends of you and your wife?
Well, that night I got a telephone call that I was arrested. That night I was 1/4 owner of the magazine. Even though I ran the day-to-day operations, I only owned 1/4 of it. I got a call from one of my business partners who told me that the other three had had a meeting and they were removing me immediately from the editor and publisher position, and that they would be having a meeting in the next several days to determine whether they wanted to move forward with the magazine or not. They ended up deciding that they didn't want to move forward, so it was over at that point. The film festival crumbled around me because once it hit the news, just about every filmmaker didn't want to be associated with it. So that was canceled within 2 days. And really, I didn't want to see anybody, even my closest friends. I only wanted my immediate family around me. I didn't even want to see my extended family, my parents, my wife, my kids. That's all I wanted. So I immediately got to my Facebook page and got rid of it. I went to my email addresses and immediately got rid of them, or just shut down the accounts. I changed my telephone number immediately because I was, as part of my bail restrictions, I couldn't have an internet-enabled phone, so I had to get one of the old school flip phones. So my phone number changed, so people could not get in touch with me, and I did that by design because I didn't want to deal with them. And when I returned from my first rehab, 3 months later, I did not want to go out in public around because everybody knew me. Every restaurant owner advertised in my magazine. You go to one of the 2 or 3 playhouses we have, or a concert hall. Everybody who ran those places knew me. They used to give me tickets for whatever I wanted and tickets to give away on our Facebook page. So I didn't want to be seen there. And I didn't want to see anybody I knew. So if I was going to go to dinner or go see a movie, we'd drive, 40, 50 kilometers out of the way to go where nobody knew who I was really. And even now, all these years later, I still feel a little bit weird going out in the community because whenever my name pops up in the media or for any reason, people absolutely shred me to pieces still on Facebook. And I think that while I know it has to do with my crime, obviously, I think that for a lot of people, what they feel is a betrayal. The ones who know me here now, I understand if you're completely disgusted by what I did, it was a disgusting thing, but you didn't know me beforehand. Beforehand, those people saw that facade that I put on, the community leader, the magazine guy, the city council guy, the good father, the good husband. They saw the act. And when I got arrested, it was like moving a curtain back, and there's the wizard behind the curtain. And what they saw was somebody who was not who he claimed to be. So I think even today, people who feel a lot of scorn towards me, it does have to do with the offense itself, but I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that they feel betrayed. I was betraying one person when I actually was somebody else, at least in their minds.
Yeah, and I guess, like you said, right at the very, very start of the show, is or the first part of the show, is that you were very good at playing a role and manipulating people at the almost like the con sort of side of it, in terms of like conning people into
Yep.
either doing what you wanted or thinking what you wanted them to think. And I think that's a very common thing for addicts generally,
Oh yeah.
because they've got to hide their behavior. They need to get what they want. So that's obviously that side of it. Obviously, eventually you would have had to face people from around the neighborhood or around town. How was that?
The people who run into me, the people who I eventually reached out towards, I would say 1 out of 3 of them would respond, and it was generally favorable. They were the kind of people who took the time to learn about what happened, or who would sit with me and listen to me, and I would explain what happened, and I'd explain my recovery, because a lot of these people I didn't see for 2 or 3 years, and it wasn't that I continued on with this horrible behavior. I took the steps to get better, and I didn't take the steps to get better just for my legal case. It's, my lawyer really drove it home to me that I needed to change who I was, legal case or not. And, when most people, when they give me the chance to sit down and talk to me, they don't dismiss what I did, but they see a changed person. They understand how sick that I was. And I think a lot of people are capable of forgiveness and capable of not defining somebody based on the absolute worst that they're capable of. Thankfully those people are out there, because they have given me that belief that, I won't be always hated by every person that I run into, that I did have for the early part of my recovery. And when I hold myself up in my home for a couple of years.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, the scary thing, I sort of think about it as well, is that what happened to you could happen to anyone. Now, some people will say, "Well, no, it couldn't, because I wouldn't look at underage girls." But you weren't looking at underage girls. You were drunk. You were off your bipolar medication. You were flicking through cam sites, which it's not really my thing, but I know people whose thing it is, and I know people who go on the like the sex cam sites and stuff like that, because that's people look at porn. It's just the way of the world, especially in 2019. So you were drunk, you were off your medication, and you were looking at porn. That's what you were doing. Millions of people around the world do that every day. But unfortunately for you, one of the people, or should we say you missed, whereas before you'd been flicking through, and if you saw a child or an underage person, or you weren't sure, you flicked off them straight away. You missed this person. You took a screenshot at the end of the conversation, and that's it. Life changed forever. So you got sentenced to, I think you said 6 months in prison?
I got sentenced to 9 months in county jail. If you're sentenced for more than 9 months in Maine, you go to state prison. I was sentenced for 9 months, so I got county jail with good time because of the job that I had there. I served 6 months and 6 days.
Right. So how was that? How was prison?
I was put into minimum security because at that point I had taken all kinds of assessments, and even the psychiatrists that the state had do the assessing for me said this guy is at no chance of recidivism, or the lowest possible chance. On a score of 1 to 100 on this one test, I scored a 1. I was probably never going to do this again. So they put me into minimum security, which is still not nice when you come to the county jail system. And they also put me in protective custody, because that's where they put the sex offenders. So I always had a guard stationed outside my door, and I didn't have the kind of guys. I lived in a pod. It's a largish room, probably, not as large as it really should have been, but I lived in a room where it had anywhere from 8 to 12 guys at any given time. And it was not the hardest time, because I wasn't fearful of my life. We had a private bathroom in the setup that we had, so I it wasn't showering with other guys. It wasn't going to the bathroom in front of them. But it was still, very miserable. I had to be wearing the same thing for 6 months. I never went outside for 6 months. I had to eat absolutely horrible food when they told me I had to eat it, or I didn't get it. I had to wake up when they told me to. I only got to take my pills when they told me that I could. Lights out was when they said it was. If somebody wasn't behaving and they turned the TV off on us, nothing I could do about it. So it wasn't pleasant. I I don't think I would have learned any more of a lesson if I would have done 1 week versus 6 months. But I think what that allowed me to do was really reflect on everything. And that's where I actually started writing my first book, was while I was there, as I mentioned in the first part, having met all those guys and so many of them having sex and porn issues and not wanting to talk about it, recognizing that, most people don't realize they have it, or most people think, like you just mentioned, they can't reach that point. For 99.8% of the time that I was a functional porn addict, I couldn't have done this thing either. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. That's one of the reasons that I wanted to get it out there. It's because I don't think I'm the porn addict that people think about. I'm not this 19-year-old guy who's never kissed a girl in real life that lives in his mom's basement. I very professional, very successful, wife, kids, 2 cars, 3 dogs. I had the life, like you mentioned. But I got to the point where my casual, or not casual, but my ongoing porn addiction led to this point. And like you said, for somebody who is watching this who says, yeah, I have a porn addiction, but it can never get there. Yes, it can. I have met doctors, lawyers, men, women, rich, poor, stupid, smart as a whip, who all fall into this category of porn addict who has gone a little too far with their addiction. And so if you think that for some reason, because you have an education or you have money or whatever it is, that you are immune to this ever happening, you're not. If you have any bit of a porn addiction, I urge people, get help. Figure out where you are in the addiction. Figure out what's going on. It's very important, because we know addiction escalates. And this is where my addiction escalated to. I didn't wake up one day and say, hey, I think I'm going to try to find a 15, 16-year-old girl online. I want to do that. No, because I wasn't even thinking at that point. I got so sick and so careless with my health that my mind allowed me to go there. I didn't let my mind go there. My mind let me. And that's when that switch happens. And if it can happen with me, it can happen with everybody. And people need to know that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that that's the... It's also the escalation from looking at porn, just like general porn sites and videos, to then going to cam sites. It's also an escalation, because the videos weren't doing it for you. You needed that interaction as well as just the images and the video and the sound. You needed the actual interaction of speaking to someone at the same time.
Right.
And obviously you talked about this kind of catfishing type thing you were doing with the video earlier. So just as we kind of finish off with your story, if you like, obviously you're a recovering alcoholic and porn addict. Do you feel now like you're completely cured all these years later, or is it still a big battle every day?
It's not a big battle every day at this point. It was in the beginning. I actually feel like the battle with alcohol is bigger. I still have dreams about drinking, and I don't about pornography. I think that a lot of these shows I go on, I'm always talking about pornography. On my website, recoveringpornaddict.com, I'm writing about pornography. So I focus on that a lot more, and I feel like I really have that in control. I don't, however, think that an addict is ever cured, because an addict changes their brain chemistry. And while brain chemistry is constantly changing throughout your life, it's not something that stays in one place. I did do damage to my dopamine receptors. I did damage to my oxytocin and my serotonin receptors. They don't work like a normal person, and they never will work. They probably will never get back to the point that they were when I was at my absolute worst, rock bottom, but I've done lasting damage. So I have to have the tools. I have to have the vigilance. I had to learn through therapy to always be questioning my motivations. Why am I doing something? What is the outcome of this going to be? And eventually it becomes almost muscle memory, where you start doing the right things and you start living the right way. So, as I get further away from, my first day of recovery, I'm now 5.5 years into it. Thankfully I've never relapsed, and I've got that kind of personality where if I'm not going to relapse, I'm not going to relapse, damn it. I'm too stubborn to relapse.
Yeah.
Or at least that's what I believe. Now, the truth is, I know that I could start drinking again. And I know that I could control it for probably a year or two. And I know after I stopped being able to control it, I could never control it again. And it would be even worse than it was before. So I have to know, and I absolutely have to be certain that I never touch or drink alcohol again. I have to be certain that when I'm here on a computer doing my work, and I make my living as a freelance writer and a ghostwriter, I have to make sure that despite the fact I have access to the internet, I'm not looking at this crap. I'm not watching Cinemax late at night or renting porno movies on pay-per-view or anything like that. And at this point, it's not a struggle. But in the very early parts of recovery, it certainly was.
Yeah, I guess you must have been watching so much porn on a daily basis that when you suddenly stopped, it must have taken a while to get out of the habit of looking at it. Because I think I can't remember if you said or if I read that you used to look at it at work as well.
Yeah, I look at a little bit of it at work, and most of it was at home late at night. One of the things that was actually great was, like I mentioned, about a week and a half after I was arrested, I went to the West Coast in California to go to my alcohol rehab. That was the best thing for me because it brought me out of my routines immediately. Suddenly, I'm living with different people, getting to know different people, having a different routine every day, very different climate because I went from cold winter here in Maine to sunny Southern California. That was not just to learn about alcohol, but just to be in a different place with a new routine. That was very, very helpful. But so the point when I came back almost 3 months later, I had been out of that routine for so long and had developed new skills and new tools that I never did relapse.
That's good. That is, it's good that you've got to a point. I mean, I read today, only this morning, that a lady, it was actually on a Facebook group about mental health, and she's been she's an alcoholic and she hadn't had a drink for 12 years, and if she's having a tough time where she's struggling, she'll still just struggling with anxiety or depression or things like that. When she sleeps, she dreams of hiding vodka in supermarkets and around the village and stuff like that, which shows you how much her brain cannot switch off from it.
Well, that's it. Addiction will always own a piece of my brain, and I'll probably have these dreams until the end of my life. In my dream, I see a pint of beer, and then I fast forward, and that pint of beer is empty. I don't drink it in the dream, but I see it, and then I all of a sudden recognize, oh my goodness, I drank this beer. I've been sober for so long. How did I do this? Why did I do this? And then I wake up, and it's such a relief.
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it, how the brain works?
It's fascinating.
So just finishing off, what are you doing? So you're doing the ghostwriting, and you're a freelance writer. Obviously, you've got your website. Where you take questions and you seem to, you're trying to help people who are either concerned about other people or, concerned about their own addictions or behaviors. Do you tend to advise people more on the porn addiction side, or is it, alcohol?
It always starts with porn. I've dealt with a lot of people who have co-occurring disorders, whether that's another substance or whether that's mental health issues, having dealt with both. But, I wrote my first book, or finished it when I got out of jail. That was really the story of my last 3-4 years before I ended up going to jail. And it was about the decline. And, told with the background of my magazine going up and down. It was about my health going up and down. The website, recoveringpornaddict.com, is more a place for resources for people if they need some help. And I also do a lot of article writing on there about my recovery and about, sometimes when things get tough or when things are good, or advice for people to read. And what I learned in having this book come out, and that came out in January 2018. And what I learned having my website for the last 2 years is just how many loved ones of porn addicts feel like there's nothing out there for them, and how many they feel like they need help. So I ended up teaming with a licensed marriage and family therapist out of California. His name is Tony Overbay. Great guy, deals with porn and sex addicts in couples as primary practice. And I ended up, I had a therapist of mine say that, it's tough for her to talk to people who are addicts because she's never been an addict. And she always feels that, or always hears, well, you don't know how I'm really feeling. You were never addicted. And it's funny because I said, well, when I'm talking to people about this, I sometimes feel, I don't mind telling my story, but I sometimes feel weird giving real advice because I don't have the, educational background that you have. So you get kind of half a story from an addict, half a story from an expert. So Tony and I combined to write this book geared towards the wives or girlfriends of male porn addicts. Now, anybody could read it. An addict could read it, a mother could read it, somebody who works with addicts or clergy could even read it and learn a lot about it. But we target it towards the wives and the girlfriends of male porn addicts who have just discovered that their loved one has this porn addiction, and they have 101 questions, and he and I go through them and we answer them one at a time from the expert's point of view and from the addict's point of view. And that book will be out in probably about 2 months.
Okay, cool. So what I'll do is in the description for the episodes is I'll link your website and your books and stuff.
And you can order my book, the first book right now, through my website or through Amazon. And as of the day that you and I are recording this, you can pre-order my book through my website. But from what I've been told, in the next several days, it'll be available pre-order on Amazon. And then it may go to stores, it may not. It may be in libraries, it may not. It's one of these things where it's hard to tell what's going to happen with distribution until it starts happening.
Of course, yeah. And do you not on social media or anything like that? Twitter or
I have a link. I have a LinkedIn page, but and anybody's welcome to find me on that. Joshua Shea. You can go to my website, and I've got a link to that on there. But for the most part, I stay off of the rest of social media because one of the great things when I was put on bail 5 years ago, I was told get off Twitter, get off Facebook. You can't be on any of this stuff. Yeah. And since I got off probation a while ago, I can get on it, but I've enjoyed my life without it. It's just so toxic, and it's the look at me society, and I don't need people saying horrible things about me or reading those things. I'm not going to engage with them. So I have my website, I have my LinkedIn page, I do things like this, so I get my interaction with people, and people can get in touch with me now very easily if they want to. But I'm not making a return to the social media world.
I gotta say, I don't blame you. It's for me, social media is a tool at the moment, which I use to promote shows.
It's a great marketing tool. When I had my magazine and my film festival, I used it as a great marketing tool. But as far as giving a peek into my life, obviously, as I explained earlier, I've always worn masks, so I don't give people real, hard peeks into my life. I like to control who gets to see into my life. Yeah. And you can't do that with social media.
No, you can't. No, indeed you can't. Joshua, thank you ever so much for joining me. Guys, you can check out Joshua's website and his books and all the links, which I'll put in the description for the episode. I'll also put links to addiction charities, mental health charities in the description. Sorry. And if you've been affected by anything we've discussed within the show, I'm sure Joshua would be happy for you to reach out to him to ask any questions, to talk
Absolutely.
to him. As always, my messages are always open. My email is available, and you can contact me. And I can't really give you solid medical advice because I'm not qualified, but I can give you an ear to listen, and I can point you in the right direction. And I will always try to do that. You can find me on Twitter at ACEcast_nation. facebook.com/ACEcastNation. And as always, you can find all our shows, all the different series and subjects on video versions at youtube.com/AcePodcastNation, or audio versions at all the usual podcasting sites and apps. Again, thank you, Joshua, for your time and the mammoth podcast that we did.
It's been a marathon, but it's been good.
Yeah, I appreciate your honesty, and I know, obviously, I know you've talked about it all before and stuff, but I appreciate you talking to me about it and maybe putting up with some of my silly questions, but it's just trying to get my head around it, something which I'm not familiar with. So,
well, and let me give you credit. Like you said, you wrestled with having me on the show, and I absolutely understand that. But you decided it was the right thing to do. You decided it was worth the conversation, and that's commendable. We need more people out there like you who are willing to give people like me platforms to talk about this, because we're not going to be able to address this problem unless we have platforms. So, hats off to you, and thank you for being brave enough to let me do this.
Yeah, thank you very much. And guys, we'll see you for the next episode.